I'm Jasper Bark, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Jasper Bark.
It's episode 248 of the Author Stories Podcast. I'd like to thank some sponsors today before we get into today's awesome interview. If you would like to sponsor the show and highlight your product or service to our audience, go to hankgarner.com and click on the advertise link in the top menu. Thanks to Daniel Arthur Smith and Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. This 19th issue of Tales from the Canyons of the Damned consists of 5 sharp, suspenseful, thought-provoking short stories, each from a different featured master of speculative fiction. Pick up the Halloween edition today. The Future Chronicles by curator and publisher Samuel Peralta. The Future Chronicles has grown from a single collection of robot stories into a series whose unique take on major science fiction and fantasy themes, AI, aliens, time travel, dragons, telepaths, zombies, immortality, galactic battles, cyborgs, doomsday, has made it one of the most acclaimed short story anthology series of the digital era. Pick up something from the Future Chronicles today. ThirdScribe is a web platform built to serve all members of the book community, readers, authors, and publishers. ThirdScribe can help you get the most out of your publishing and reading experience. Connecting readers and writers, give ThirdScribe.com a look today. From Book 1 of the Paragons Trilogy by C. Stephen Manley, When Dark Portals Open, Heroes Will Awaken. Israel Trent is a man living his dream as a crime reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Erin Sims is a young woman whose life is a blur of neon lights, drug-fueled diversions, and being in the wrong places with the wrong people. These two strangers wake up together in a modern-day dungeon with no memory of how they got there and come face-to-face with monsters that neither ever dreamed existed. Rescued by agents of the mysterious Sentry Group, the duo soon find their lives turned upside down. Awaken is the first book of the Paragons Trilogy. It's a gripping origin story filled with mystery, fast-paced action, horrific threats, and bewildering fringe science. If you enjoy an action thriller with a heavy dose of the fantastic, you'll love C. Stephen Manley's Awakened. Essence, Book 1, Septima series by Nick Breaker. Troy, with his irrational fears, is the least likely person to lead a war, but that doesn't mean he can escape his destiny. A trip to New Orleans turns into something much larger when aliens kidnap him and his friends. A perfect doppelganger for their dead General Tomaz, Troy is thrust into the front lines of battle against Reptaran invaders. As he struggles to maintain control of his own destiny, Troy knows that no matter the outcome, his life will never be the same. Explore the mind of this unlikely hero in Essence, the first book in a new sci-fi series by Nick Breaker, a coming-of-age tale full of adventure and steamy encounters. Pick up Essence, Book 1 by Nick Breaker today. Music City Macabre by Bob Williams is some of the best action, adventure, horror you'll ever read. Music City will never be the same as you have a front row seat for the end of the world. Give this series a look today, Music City Macabre by Bob Williams. Stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
Hey everybody, it's Josh Hayes, and I'm here with Chuck Manley and Scott Moon. We are Keystroke Medium, and this is the Keystroke Medium Minute. Hey everybody, it's Josh. Welcome back to the Keystroke Minute. I am here with Chuck and Scott, and today we're going to be talking about testing different processes. I think a lot of people kind of get worried and concerned about using the correct process, and I was a pantser for a very long time, and now I am a very staunch outliner. And I think testing these different processes and coming up with even original ones or picking and choosing from different writers will help you build yourself as an author. So we'll start out with Scott today. Scott, you're a pretty good planner, kind of a born-again planner, as it were.
Yeah, I'm pretty born again. You know, I've written myself into corners. I started out the Stephen King type method where I just go, sit down and start writing. So my expertise on this topic comes from my propensity to try anything. So I've tried planning and plotting. I've read every single book that you can write on the different ways to produce a book. I do spreadsheets to track my process, all these different things. Some of them are more useful than others. So I guess what I'd like to bring to this topic is that try different things, find something that works the best for you, and then kind of stick to it and give it some time to kind of germinate and kind of tweak it. So that's the big thing, is if it's working for you, it's the right way. And there's literally every single person we've interviewed in the last couple of years on our show has had a slightly different method. Whatever gets the story well told is the right way.
Yeah, I agree with that totally, Scott. There is no overarching method that is the perfect one for every single writer out there. I've been at this for roughly 3 decades, and I, in the last 10 years or so, finally settled on something that I know works for me every time. And it's just a culmination of things that I've cherry picked from different methods and knowing what I know about novels and actually from screenplay structure. So really it's a matter of just sitting down and finding out what you need to know to find what works for you individually.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And as I said at the beginning, I used to be a pantser, and now I meticulously plot and plan everything. And sometimes I start out with an idea and I plot to get to that idea, and then other times I start out with just a character and I kind of sketch out a little bit of what that character is going to do, and then I get a plot and then I outline it from there. But I feel like with an outline or with a plot, a plan rather, you can kind of see where you're going. And like Scott said, you get lost sometimes if you pants and you're writing and you're like, I really like this character, and a week later you have no idea where that character is going because you haven't thought about it ahead of time.
Right.
No, I was just gonna say, but plotting doesn't work for everyone. And we've had several people on our show that are ridiculously against plotting, and they write from the seat of the pants. And I think George R. R. Martin writes from well, he says he's a gardener, I think is what he calls it. But
gardener or architect,
right?
Well, I think also we should say that there, it's not a case of absolutes. You don't have to be one or the other. And I think 90% of us fall somewhere in the middle, and you have to find that middle ground for yourself.
We talked about recently that sometimes even if you're a pantster or discovery writer, is that you might make the outline and then throw it away, but it can be a discovery process to kind of free up the subconscious. So mix and match.
Absolutely. I think so. So whatever your process is, I challenge you to try something different. I challenge you to take some bits and pieces of other people's processes, smash them together, and see if it works better for you. See if you get something cooler out of it. Okay, well, this has been Josh for Chuck and Scott. Thanks for listening to this Keystroke Minute. You can find more of our show at keystrokemedium.com, where we have author interviews and craft discussion and a lot of shenanigans. Come out and hang out with us.
Shenanigans.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Jasper Bark on the show with me today. Jasper is a writer of significant talent and a significantly wide body of work, and I'm really excited to get to the story behind Jasper's stories. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm very happy that you're here, Jasper. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, it goes right back to probably pre-kindergarten. I would have been 4 or 5 years old. And this is back in the 1970s. We have a TV channel over here, a TV station, called BBC. It's the station that produces Doctor Who and also Downton Abbey and a lot of other stuff that you'll see sort of on Masterpiece Theatre or used to over in the States.
Sure.
It's kind of like our PBS. It's a publicly owned station. It's paid for by all those who pay TV licenses. And in the 1970s, it was run by a lot of very socially progressive people. And there was one show, a lot of the TV programs for children those days were supposed to entertain but mainly uplift and educate. And there was one show they used to have on that was incredibly dull and extremely boring called Why Don't You? And this was actually a shortened title, because the full title for the show was Why Don't You Switch Off Your Television Set and Go and Do Something Less Boring Instead? That's right. In the 1970s, British TV presenters were actually trying not to sell children candy or toys with far too many flashing lights that would send them into seizures. They were actually attempting to get children to switch off television so they could lower their ratings. This program featured, it was presented by other children, most of whom were very precocious kids who came from very, very nice upper middle class backgrounds, whose parents could afford to send them to stage school, and they were every bit as awkward and precocious as you can imagine. And they would present little clips, which were tiny mini documentaries of children who were off doing rock climbing or stamp collecting or setting fire to hobos. Actually, I lied about that last bit. And these kids were apparently all having far more fun doing what they were doing rather than us kids who were watching them on television. And this wasn't a program that you particularly watched. It was one where you watched when it was raining outside, when you'd read all your comic books, when you'd fought with your siblings, and there was nothing else to do. And this particular individual episode had one little segment that probably completely changed my life, because it featured a group of kids who were making their own comics. I remember very, very clearly the kids standing there at things saying, "Hello, my name is Michael, and I like to draw my own comics. And all I need is some felt tip pens and some paper and a stapler." And then they proceeded to show Michael and his friends actually drawing comic books, stapling the pages together, drawing the little comics. And this set off probably more synapses in my brain at that moment than I've ever had before in my life. In fact, as I sat there and watched this with my mouth absolutely open, I don't think I have ever been as excited in my entire life. Nothing. Not even the birth of my first child, not even marriage to my wife, not even the first time my wife consented to be my husband or consented to other things. None of those quite register on the same Richter scale of excitement that I had in that moment, thinking, wait, stop, back up. You, meaning I can actually create my own comics. I can make my own comics that I write and draw. I possibly every single molecule in my body was vibrating with excitement, because I had felt tip pens, I had paper, I even knew there was a stapler somewhere in the drawer of my mother's cupboards. I could make my own comics. And so I instantly, the minute the rather turgid, extremely dull, very worthy program had finished, switched off the television set, ran and went to find paper so I could fold it up, staple it together, and then draw my own comics, which were rather bad. I'm absolutely no artist. I have no talent whatsoever at all. However, I was utterly hooked on the concept of telling my own stories. And in fact, that Christmas, I was so obsessed with just sitting and drawing comics and writing stories. My parents actually had to take away my felt tip pens and my paper, confiscate them, so I would come and open the presents that were under the tree.
That's great. Oh, Jasper, do you remember what that first idea was that you wanted to draw and write? In those days, children's comics in the UK were all little anthology titles, and they were humour comics aimed at kids. And my favourite humour comic was called Monster Fun, and it would have strips in it sort of similar to things like the Munsters and the Addams Family. It would have strips about ghosties and ghoulies and Frankenstein style monsters and large King Kong style gorillas. Rather than wreaking havoc, though, these particular monsters were all lovable and very cuddly and fun. It was kind of like the Groovy Ghoulies, writ large. And I'm pretty sure the comics that I drew were very, very pale imitations of the things I was reading, because I was only like about 4 or 5 years old. And probably a lot of what I wrote in the word bubbles was almost unintelligible, because I only just really learned to write. As I said, I was like a kindergarten kid at that point.
Although in my country we called it infant school, but it's effectively the same thing. And it was, and I did continue to write and draw comics right throughout kindergarten into the first grades. And I also began. My father, he was local shop steward for his union. He would bring home union logbooks, and I would steal these, and I would write stories, because one page was lined and one page was blank. So I'd write a story and then illustrate it. But mostly what I was writing, I think, like most writers in those days, was pretty much what I was reading. I was just regurgitating and slightly changing it.
Sure. And it's a magical moment, Jasper, and it's such a wonderful thing that it happened to you so young, so early, is that when you realize that the books that you buy and or given as gifts and you read, that there's a disconnect between the thing that you're holding and that someone actually made this, and when that veil is rent in two, and you realize that the people that make these things are real people just like you. What an empowering moment in the mind of a child. I love that it happened for you so early, and the mystique of it was kind of taken away.
Absolutely, and I have been hooked ever since. And I think I always wanted to be an actor, and that's something I have pursued professionally, but it's not my primary talent. I think my primary talent is writing. But I think I recall I was about 8 or 9 years old when it suddenly dawned on me, I'm going to be doing this as my job when I get old enough. I wasn't quite certain how I was going to do that, or anyone went about doing that. But as you say, I was quite certain I was reading quite voraciously in my local library, and any thrift store or yard sale where I could get hold of the type of books I wanted to read. And it occurred to me that these books are being sold, therefore people are being paid to write them. So one day I'm going to be the guy that writes the books and gets paid for it.
Right. So when you've got this idea in your mind, when you're sufficiently grown, this is something you're going to pursue. But what did you study in school? Did you pursue this as a career, or did you do the respectable thing and get training for a regular job and pursue writing as a hobby?
No. I was the UK equivalent of a high school dropout. In my country at the time, everybody would leave school at the age of 16, and those who were really clever would go on to graduate from high school. You'd do 2 sets of exams, and you'd either go and get a kind of blue collar job if you left school at 16, or you'd stay on for another 2 years in something they would call the sixth form, and you'd attempt to get another set of exams which would allow you to possibly go to university or possibly go and get a job in an office. And I dropped out before that. And in fact, actually, at my school, we had to have a little form which said, what jobs are you going to do when you leave school? And I wrote at the top, Poet Laureate, which is an official position that the Queen has a preferred poet who writes poems and gets a small stipend for writing these poems, and gets a free crate of wine from the local royal cellar. And it's a very, very great honour. And so I wrote my things, what 3 jobs you want to do? And I wrote Poet Laureate, professional author, freelance journalist. And they looked at this, and I came from a very rural, lower working class town, and they thought I was just completely taking the mickey. So they said, no, this won't do. Go away, Bark, and write this out again and put something proper. And I thought, well, that is what I want to do. So I wrote it again, Poet Laureate, freelance journalist, author. And I got then hauled over the coals, pulled in front of the headmaster, told off for taking the mickey out of such things. This was a very, very important thing. This was an extremely important document. I must write something properly. So I wrote it again, and I wrote the same 3 things. That's what I want to be when I got. And they actually suspended me from school in the last week of my school, so I couldn't properly graduate. So
they effectively invited you not to come back.
Yes. So I, in effect, yes, get out and do not darken our doors ever again. So I I left home at 17, and I sofa surfed and was a bit of a bum. And then at 18, I looked into working for a theatre company, and I kind of worked my way up through the ranks there as a performer in training and as a playwright. So that was really the closest thing I had to any sort of education I learned on the job. And I also, from the age of about 15, 16, I used to bunk off school, play hooky, and go and join. In those days, we didn't have comedy clubs or a comedy club circuit in the UK. This is the mid 80s. It was beginning to form, but it hadn't got as far north as the part of the world I lived. But there were things called working men's clubs, where guys, regular blue-collar guys, would come and sit and drink a pint, and comics would stand up and tell very blue, extremely rude jokes, usually about midgets and nuns and nymphomaniac housewives who were having it away behind their husband's back. And I developed a series of comedy skits, and I used to go and play these clubs and other kind of clubs like that. So I sort of carried on doing that, doing bits of stand-up, working in theatre and performances, and I got 1 or 2 grants to do this. And when I was about 19 or so, I set up a theatre cooperative venture with a bunch of my friends who I'd met, all of us who were living very hand-to-mouth existence, kind of working in the theatre.
I love that, Jasper. And, there's a very common thread that runs through so many episodes of this podcast where writers have had a history in theater, or, it's a common pursuit. It's a hobby, or they run hand in hand. I wonder often if writers are sometimes frustrated actors, and sometimes working with other people, or just in the medium itself, and sometimes it's difficult to get across the exact thing that we're trying to say or do. But when you sit down with the page, you are in complete control, and you are the director, you're the writer, you're the producer, you are in complete control. What do you think about the kind of dual lives of actors and writers, and how they seem to seg so often?
It is quite fascinating, and I think those authors who write really good dialogue are often authors who've performed dialogue, because They're probably sitting there reading it aloud, or they have an ear for dialogue because they're used to performing it. And even if it's not specifically realistic, it will have a rhythm. They'll catch the nuances and the cadences of spoken word, and they'll put it into their work. And often they tend also to, because when you're writing, I mean, you must know this yourself being an author, one of the subconscious things we always aim at is a musicality and a sense of rhythm in what we write. And sometimes adding or taking away a word will change the entire feel of a sentence, because it adds a rhythm. You can almost count out the meter to it, and suddenly it feels really, really good. And I think that's one of the things that being an actor brings. But also, I think one of the wonderful things, you were mentioning how in control you are as a writer, and you often are, although I had a brilliant quote from Alfred Bester, the science fiction author, The Star's My Destination and Tiger, Tiger, and which was the story is the boss. And it's quite fascinating how the number of times I sometimes think my story is a lot cleverer than me, and I carefully did something out. Sometimes stories take a direct, something will happen in the story that completely surprises me. Oh, why didn't I think of that? Because it comes out of the blue. But to get back to I've gone off on a slight tangent there. To get back to the actors, authors thing, the joy of being an author over being an actor is, or a performer, because I've done both, is that you're only ever as good as the moment in which you perform as an actor. And a number of times you come off stage, you might have a great performance, but on the bus or the train back from the gig where you've been, you'll play the gig over and over in your mind, and you'll think, oh, I should have extended that pause. Oh, I should really have emphasized that word a bit more. If I just pushed that a bit more, I could have got more of a laugh out of that. Oh, it would have been so much better if I did, over and over and over. And you're always running through your performance, always thinking how you ought to have done better, always criticizing yourself. The beauty and the brilliance of writing is that you can go back. you can go back to that moment in your performance and think, do you know what? I just need to extend that beat a little bit. And you can do that. You can say, do you know what? I didn't need to say that one little line. That was just one line too many. And it would be much funnier if I just left it hanging. And you can cut that sentence out. Writing is much more of a perfectible art than performances. Performance is always absolutely in the moment. And you're working on an instinct and you're bringing all your training to bear on one particular moment. And some moments you literally are better than others. Some nights you are better than others. Some nights you kill it. Other nights you just about get away with it. And the odd occasional night you absolutely crash and burn. But as a writer, as long as obviously you kind of eventually meet your deadline and your editor comes round and beats you over the head and pries your manuscript out of your nearly cold dead fingers and says, stop, write something else. Within that kind of time frame, even though it was Oscar Wilde who said great works of art are never really finished, they're only ever abandoned, you can abandon it a lot later and you can make it a lot more perfect than a performance, which I think is why a lot of actors, a lot of performers are drawn to writing, because you can, if not totally perfect it, you can get a lot closer to perfection than you can necessarily with a performance.
And I think conversely, Jasper, that a lot of writers would love to get on the stage, if they don't, to feel what it is to have that magic that happens in the moment. And because when you do kill, when you really, land it and it's just right and you find just the right emotional beat that resonates with the audience, to get that immediate feedback, is something that writers, strive for a lot and maybe is kind of a little bit of an unrequited, feeling. Is it that we write something and we edit it and we perfect it in the hopes that it will emotionally connect with someone, and then we may never know if it does or not. But when you're standing on stage and you feel that energy come back from the audience, that's a completely different feeling. And so I think these things are kind of a yin and a yang, and there's a lot of push and pull between these two arts in that we respect each other. And I think we both long to have what the other one has.
I completely agree. I completely agree. And that's an extremely good point, that instant gratification that you get from a performance. You don't get that as a writer, and you get it an awful lot more now since the dawn of the internet. I actually began my writing career before most people had the internet. So you would wait to get a review in a magazine or a fanzine, and it would be months, sometimes years after you'd written the piece and handed it in to your editor before you got any kind of a response to it. Nowadays, you get a lot more. You get quite a wall of feedback sometimes, which is a good and a bad thing. Too much feedback isn't that great, but yes, you don't quite get that moment where you sit back, you type a perfect sentence. It's absolutely amazing, and no one. You don't have an entire audience rising to their feet, applauding you, cheering you, picking you up on their shoulders and charging out of your study with you into the streets going, look at this genius, even though probably in your mind you do. Right. In actuality, you just sit there in your underwear, jumping up and down. Your wife comes in and goes, what? Do you know what time it is in the morning? You're waking the kids. And you go, but this sentence. Shut up. I have to have work in here for work in the morning.
Yes, I think everyone listening is nodding. Yes, I know that feeling. Let's talk about your writing career, Jasper. How did you had the acting cooperative, the theater cooperative, and that's going well. What was it that drove you back to the page? So you early on you had your felt tip pens and your stapler, but what brought you back?
Well, I always wrote. My writing was predominantly for stage up until my mid-20s, at which point I was in a fully committed relationship. I had rent to meet and bills to pay, and living a hand-to-mouth existence as a performer, mainly as a stand-up at that point, was fun, but you get to a certain age, we need a little bit more money, and I actually just completely BS'd my way into being a journalist. I was living in London at the time, and I just phoned up magazines.
I've completely BS'd my way into being a podcaster. So,
yeah, and I just wrote to editors and said I'd like to write an article about this, and then I would turn up at bars where these people drank and said, "Hello, you wrote for this magazine. Can I buy you a drink?" And they'd think, "Who are you, strange-looking young man? All right, buy me a drink." And eventually, I talked my way into a journalism career. One job led to another job, and I became a film and music journalist. So effectively, while I was living in London throughout my 20s, my job was really to go out. I went out to cover gigs. I went out to cover films. For a brief while, a little bit later on, I became a theatre critic because I missed going to the theatre so much. When I wasn't actually going out and covering other people's gigs, I was standing up and performing myself. But there was at the back of my mind, particularly if I was spending most of my professional life talking to highly creative people from the point of view of somebody else who themselves was also creative. And there was this nagging itch that what I was doing wasn't quite creative enough. I was just either responding mainly to other people's creativity rather than creating something myself. I began to realize, on the wrong side of that microphone. And as much fun as it was, and I met some extremely famous people, got to watch some incredible careers get launched, had some very bizarre incidences. One interviewee attempted to take off my trousers in the middle of an interview. I got invited to go and be a sex performer at a club in Ibiza called Manumission, which put on live sex shows for the completely drugged up ravers that were there at the time, and had a whole series of very fascinating incidences and a lot of stories I could tell. I got thrown out. Attempted to interview Marshall Mathers in his first US tour, and for some bizarre reason, he decided to do this particular interview in the toilet of his hotel suite. And halfway, I was there with another female journalist, and she asked him a question about his slightly misogynistic lyrics, and he's this giant African American minder. I'm not a tall guy, but I was like pretty much on an eye level with this guy's belt buckle. It went, "All right, I see where this is going. Okay, Marshall, you don't say anything at all." And he picked me up by the scruff of my neck, and my feet weren't even touching the floor. And he pushed me in this thing out into the corridor and threw me on the ground. That was it. My interview was stopped. And so the next time his next album came out, the one with Stan on it, I thought, right, I'm so gonna cut him a new backside. Sat down, put it on, absolutely looking forward to hating it and tearing the work apart, and was absolutely, utterly dismayed to find it was actually extremely very good, and I could only really praise it. But so anyway, sorry, I'm getting off into stories of journalists. But the thing was that really got to me was that I wasn't actually creating. However, I was in this very nice position where pretty much any gig or any film that was coming out, I could go and see for free whenever I wanted to. So I began phoning up editors who worked for fiction magazines, and also specifically who worked on the comics I wanted to go and write for. And I just say to them, "Hello, I'd like to write for you. I can get you into any gig. I can get you to see any film you want to go see months before it comes out for free, and I can probably get you drunk as well for free." Because I had linking down to a fine art by that point and freeloading as a journalist. And many editors actually found this far too tempting to turn down. So I then made the jump. I was writing as a journalist, and I began to write scripts for comics, back to comics again. And those were my first professional fiction sales. I did write a tiny bit of erotica for women's magazines a little bit before that, but that wasn't as creatively fulfilling as writing comics. And I was eventually able to make almost as much money writing comics, this is by the beginning of the noughties, as I had been able to make as a journalist. I was on quite a good wage as a journalist by that point. So that was really how I then got started. From writing comics, though comics was extremely good fun. A lot of the publishers who published the comics were also publishing novels, and they began to ask me if I'd like to pitch for some of the licensed characters that they were publishing novels about. So I ended up writing for all kinds of licensed products, from DreamWorks characters all the way through to Freddy Krueger and Blade and New Line Cinema things. And so I kind of I didn't really know anything at all about how to write. I knew how to write comics and comic scripts because I think probably because I've been doing it since knee high, and I found it very, very easy. But changing over to writing prose, it took me a few novels, and sadly those novels were all in print, and people can go and read me when I was absolutely atrocious and grinding out words like a latter day Paul Pack to meet the bills, basically. So that was my beginning, really. But it was it was a good education. I actually got paid to learn how to write a novel, and after I'd written about 3 or 4 of them, I began to have a small idea, and my reviews started to get better.
Well, there's really no better way to learn to write than to write. There's so many resources out there that you can pick up little pieces of skill here and there, and they're I like to think of them as tools in your toolbox.
Absolutely.
But you can have all the tools needed to build a car, and if you've never built a car, you're not going to build a car. You can have all the things necessary, but at some point you have to start taking those pieces, using the tools, and putting them together. And the only way to get better and faster at building a car is to build cars.
That is so incredibly true. You can read all the manuals for every different model of car. You can read loads and loads of magazines about it, but until such time as you've got under that hood and taken the engine apart, you don't really have any idea. And to go back to performing, when I was a very, very young stand-up, sometimes I'd do gigs and the guy on before me would absolutely kill it, and his material was lousy. It was really weak. And I'd come on bounding after him with much better, much cleverer material and just do okay. I'd get a polite applause and some polite laughter, and I'd think, well, what's that guy got that I haven't got? How come he got all those laughs and I didn't get them? And after I'd been doing it for about a year, it began to dawn on me that the reason the guys ahead of me, even though his material wasn't that great, was getting loads of laughs was because he'd been doing it for quite a while. He just knew how to get a laugh out of an audience because he'd done it night in, night out for several years. And once I began to do it night in, night out for several years, I just kind of worked it out, and I could get away with dreadful, incredibly lame, awful material on an off day, because I just knew how to get a laugh. I knew how to pitch it, how to have a certain face. And it is the same thing. It is that kind of, that absolute marathon grind of sit down. You have 2.5 months. You have 90,000 words. That has to be put into the hands of your publisher. And it has to be proofed. And it has to be as mistake-free as you can possibly make it. It has to be legible. And there has to be as few plot flaws in it as you can possibly see. Go! This will involve at certain points completely severing any contact and ties with any other human being, including your close family, locking the door, pouring yourself several gallons of coffee, and probably staying up writing for 3 or 4 nights without any sleep just to make that deadline. But you don't just make the deadline, you begin to make yourself into a writer. You learn how it's done. And then it's inevitable that everything that you read after that point, having gone through that baptism of fire, you begin to spot how clever the really good writers are, and you begin to have a lot more respect for them. You stop thinking, oh dear, they did that terribly wrong and they did that wrong, and you start noticing all the things they're doing extremely right, and thinking, wow, okay. And yeah, you have a lot more respect for the masters because you've been through it. You know what you have to go through. You know what it takes. And when someone does it well, boy, are you impressed.
Jasper, it all started for you with writing comics, and you are still writing comics now. As a matter of fact, you have a brand new one out called Parasassin. But what is it about the medium of comics that that is so expressive. It transcends the sum of its parts. There are books with text and pictures, and then there's this unique medium that's a blend, and the sum of the parts is greater than the value of the parts themselves. What is it about the medium that becomes something transcendent?
It's actually down to the way your brain processes information. The US Army, back in the 1950s, when they were spending a lot of time overseas and they were having to come to the aid of a lot of different nations out in places like Korea and Vietnam and down in Haiti, and interacting with lots of cultures, and they had to do a lot of explaining about a lot of key issues, found that one of the single most perfect ways of communicating was the comic book. This is partly because throughout the Second World War, the GIs had found comic books to be really entertaining, and they kept up the spirits of a lot of guys out on the front line. And they're always for sale in most of the army stores, comic books. And some of the brighter lieutenants picked these up and thought, they've got something here. So, and they did a lot of investigation into why comics are one of the single best ways for putting over information and communicating. And it's down to the fact that there are two sections of the brain which process information: the front and left parietal lobe and the front right parietal lobe. And the left parietal lobe, that processes textual information, all written information. And whenever you read text in any way or take in any written information, that's the part of the brain that processes it. When we take in visual information, we look at pictures, we watch films, that's the right parietal lobe, which is lit. And you can actually put electrodes into people's brains, and you can see the electricity moving to the other part of the brain when they begin to process this. But comics is possibly the only artistic form in which the front and left and right parietal lobes are working at the same time, because it mixes text with pictures. And to my mind, the absolute genius of the comic strip is the word balloon, the word bubble, because that takes textual information, and by placing it inside a balloon that then it comes out of a character's mouth, turns textual information into a visual icon. And it means your brain has to read, not just look at what's going on in the picture, not just read the text, but make a causal link between the two simultaneously, and make a causal link between each one of the sequential images on the page, so that they all appear to be not just moving in sequence, but actually they have it. You can take a story out of the active sequence, and that's why it is such a magical form. It's the closest, possibly other form you can get to music, in that most comics are produced by a team of people, like a little group, like a band, and you have your rhythm section in the form of the inkers and the colorists who work on it. And you also have your accompanists in the form of the guys who actually write in and place the word bubbles on the page. You have your lead singers in the form of the writers who think up the characters and write the captions and break down the story into specific panels. And then you kind of have your lead guitarist down front, grandstanding guy, who is the artist, who actually carries the greatest weight of the story. And that's the challenge for a writer working in the medium, particularly one like myself who can't draw at all. And many really good comic writers have some artistic skill, and often began as artists, realized they couldn't be as good as they wanted to be, and so they became writers. I have no talent as an artist, but I can write for artists, and it's using somebody else's talent and skills to tell a story you want to tell, that then becomes a joint story. And if it's working out really, really well, just like a really good tight group of musicians, it becomes, as you say, greater than the sum of any one individual contribution, greater than the sum of its parts. Not just really good text. It's not just really good prose or really good dialogue. It's not just really pretty pictures. It's an amazingly skillfully told story that uses talents of a huge group of people. And that's what the best comics are.
I've never once thought to make the connection between a comics team and a band, but that is a beautiful analogy. I think that completely holds up and explains that. I've never thought about it that way, but I will always think about it that way from now on.
And there's the same amount of egos and grandstanding and discourse, and you get absolute killer rock star teams who then eventually get totally fall in love with their own egos and split up and never quite ever reach the same heights again that they did with each other. So yeah, there are a lot of correlations, and in the best teams, everybody has respect for everybody else's talent, and everybody adds something unique that nobody else can bring to that particular tune or that comic strip.
Right. You talked earlier about getting your start in some of these kind of working class clubs and trying your hand at stand-up comedy and comedy sketches and things like that. And you said that these were places, that were perfect places for kind of body humor and to go really blue and to really push boundaries. And in your writing, you tend to like to carry over some of those same themes and really push boundaries, whether it be horror or in some of the more erotic pieces that you've done and things like that. What is it about pushing boundaries that you love, and kind of what are you setting out to accomplish when you write a piece like that?
That's a very good question, and it's one of those things that you have to think an awful lot about, mainly because I sometimes kind of feel like Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy just thinking, what another fine mess I've got myself into, because I have found myself on the wrong side of authority for the things that I've written throughout most of my life. I was always the school with the smart mouth who was always sent out into the corridor because he just couldn't shut up and just at the right time. As a writer, as a stand-up, I found myself in all kinds of trouble. Sometimes the theatre cooperative I mentioned before, we ended up getting closed down for staging a bonfire night event that was the single most attended event ever put on in the city of Carlisle, but absolutely outraged the authorities for some of the antics we got up to. I had a play banned at the Edinburgh Festival, and it caused a big tabloid stir. I actually saw members of my actors get arrested in the street for attempting to hand out leaflets for the play, like we were living in some kind of Soviet country. And I do think, I've constantly been censored, even as a journalist. And I do think, why am I always getting in trouble? What is this? What about me? Why am I constantly pushing at those? And I think it's the simple fact that that we do have boundaries. And as a parent, now as somebody who has to exercise a certain amount of authority, I do appreciate that there are some areas of human existence in which we have to have boundaries. And there are certain boundaries upon human behavior which are incredibly important. It is not ever a good idea in any way. It's never excusable. There's no way you can excuse sexual relationships between an adult and a child. That's a boundary that nobody should ever cross or even think about crossing, for instance. So you kind of have to accept that. But there are a lot of boundaries that sometimes are, they're mainly just cultural boundaries. We've drawn a line in the sand, and then no one's ever stepped over that, and people just never think what's on the other side of that line drawn in the sand. And some people want to walk up and go, why is this line here? Why is there a boundary? Can we not discuss this? And often because it is a taboo, because it is a boundary, some people won't want to discuss it. And there, I think, within every person, there is, we all have our own kind of like grumpy, red-necked, disgruntled conservative, and we all have our kind of banner-waving, hippified kind of liberal radical. And those two are off. Sometimes they're at war with each other, but also, and I think that's why, and there are some things that none of us will countenance, and there's some things that all of us want to question. And
there, at any given day, I might be one or the other at various points in the same day.
Yeah, particularly as you age.
Yeah, exactly.
The old man certainly comes out, and you catch yourself thinking, did I really say that? Honestly? And a society at large also has to have these. There was a very, very, very good reason why, in the tribe, the person who would never, ever, 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 ever want to kind of go beyond the particular horizon, because there were monsters out there. They never wanted to leave the cave because there were cave bears out there. And those people guaranteed that some members of the tribe would survive, and they wouldn't die. They wouldn't eat those berries just in case they were poisoned. They wouldn't eat those mushrooms in case they did get weird visions out of them and they didn't want thank you very much. And they wouldn't try any of these newfangled things like wheels in case they rolled down a mountainside and broke their neck. And those people were there to hold the tribe back from going completely ridiculous. But the tribe would have stayed living in a cave wearing bear skins, unless there were a few people who went, do you know what? Why don't we actually put something on top of this log and give it a push? Wow, look, I've invented the wheel. Why don't we attempt actually, to maybe stick a load of feathers on my arms and I'll jump off a cliff? Whoop, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. But these people are they're like an evolutionary force. They push at the boundaries. So we need people to hold us back, and we need people to push. I think I am one of those evolutionary people that tests boundaries, that looks at taboos, that wants to question them, and to start a dialogue. And sometimes, occasionally, taboos which have been very useful to a society in previous ages no longer become useful. And you need people to question boundaries and barriers. You need people to push a little bit for the sake of our collective freedoms, for the sake of our collective sanity, and for the sake of the future, for all the new challenges that we're going to have to face, and the ways in which we're going to change to accommodate those challenges. And I think that's why I am instinctively drawn to taboo. Tell me that I can't talk about something, and it will drive me mad. I will have to know why. I will have to talk about it. Tell me not to think of an elephant. I'll think of every kind of elephant you can possibly think about. Tell me not to talk about this or not to do this. I'll want to go and do it. I was always that kid. Sadly, I've never grown out of that part of it. I'm now that adult. And I guess that's why I run up against taboos. I don't do it to be clever. I don't do it necessarily to gain attention for myself, and I don't do it to hurt, upset, or outrage people from any malign or reason whatsoever at all. I just want to start a conversation. I want to push people out of their comfort zone, and I want to do it gently. And I think when they get to the end of it, they will either do one of two things. They'll think that there was a perfectly good reason that taboo was there in the first place, and it will reinforce their views, in which case I'm perfectly happy, at least that they've learned that there was a reason they had that viewpoint and they want to hang on to it. Or they might have had the opportunity to think of it in a new light, and perhaps consider there are times and places and occasions when maybe that taboo isn't quite as strict as they thought it ought to be before they made my work.
Jasper, we as writers, we also get the opportunity to kind of peek into the darker areas of our human nature and to the world around us. And we're recording this around Halloween. We're about a week away from Halloween, and I think one of the reasons that holiday is so popular is because most of us are sweet-natured, well-rounded people, and there's not much opportunity to look at the darkness and to try to kind of see, what it is about the darker, portion of our nature that we wrestle with. And in writing horror and then in turn reading horror, do you think that allows us to remain well-rounded individuals because we do have an outlet to, kind of deal with the things that are not accessible to us on a daily, on a daily basis?
I think that's a huge, huge part of it. And anybody who spent time at fantasy and horror conventions in the company of lots of other horror writers is often struck by how amazingly sweet, kind, gentle, good-natured, and generally self-effacing people they are. And I think there's a very, very good reason for that. I remember interviewing. His name's got out of my head. Never mind. The guy who plays Jean-Luc Picard.
Patrick Stewart.
Patrick Stewart.
Yes.
That's one of the loveliest chaps I ever met. I'm so sorry I forgot his name. And he was talking about at that particular year he'd been playing a villain in a piece he'd just finished, and he'd also been on stage playing Iago, and he'd just done a conspiracy theory piece. This is back in the late 90s, and he couldn't help saying that he'd spent all year playing these horrible villainous people, and it was probably the happiest year of his life because he had a place to put all the bad feelings. There is a saying in psychotherapy that if you can play with it, you've got it. If you can't play with it, it's got you. And the thing about our dark side is if we attempt in the very Victorian way to either suppress it or to kind of section it off and cut it away from us, like Dr. Jekyll did in creating Mr. Hyde, it inevitably comes back to bite us in the backside. There is a drawback. You can't suppress it. I think what we do as writers, I always think of it as dancing with my dark side. I acknowledge that there are sides to my character of which I am probably quite ashamed, of which I'm not proud, that are destructive and that work against me, and that will say and do things that I may not entirely as a sane, rational, fully functioning adult really agree with. If I pretend that that's not there, then I just empower it. If I acknowledge it, if I accept it, and if I am ready to own it, and in effect find a story where I can explore it, and I can explore the dark side of other people, I can not only, in effect, not necessarily disempower it, but learn to live in a much greater harmony with it. I can also create stories where other people can do the same thing. So that's very much what I feel I do in horror fiction, reading and writing it. I bow to my dark side. It becomes a dance partner. We take a very dark and somewhat dangerous waltz together. At the end of it, we kind of bow, I shake curts or whatever, and we go on our way. And that's what I'm doing, dancing with my dark side.
I love it. I love it. Jasper, you've got some new releases that we want to send people to go check out. You've got a new novella called Quiet Places, a novella of cosmic horror, and you've also got that comic that talked about earlier, Parassassin. Tell us a little bit about these two projects and why people why you think they might like them.
Quiet Places. I am actually known for being quite a gory and quite a racy horror writer. Quiet Places is the first time I've written a completely bloodless, totally non-violent, not the least bit erotic or racy novel anyway. No one even gets so much as a paper cut. It's very atmospheric, and yet it's probably one of the more disturbing things I've ever written, for all the lack of violence in it. If you like dark atmospheric fiction that builds to the type of climax that will hang around in your dreams and your thoughts for months and possibly even years to come, this is a novel. It's set in the Scottish Highlands. It involves a young couple come up from the city, and he is the last in the line of a series of lairds, and he comes back to accept the family title in this tiny little utterly remote town called Dunballen. But this town has a very dark secret, and there are secrets within secrets, and he sits absolutely the center of it. And it's up to, this chap David McCavendish, and it's up to his partner Sally to rescue him from this, and to face down the people of Dunballen. However, it's one of those books that contains revelation within revelation, and each time you hit a new revelation, it only throws up more questions until you reach a climax that will take you somewhere you had no idea you were going to be in this place, and it will catch you completely off guard. Parassassin, on the other hand, actually is science fiction. And it was originally serialized in an online webcomic called Aces Weekly, which was founded by David Lloyd. He's the guy who drew V for Vendetta. And he also designed that famous Guy Fawkes mask, which is used by everyone from the Lulz hackers through to the rioters in the Arab Spring. And the guys who were camping out in Wall Street and occupying Wall Street. He kind of drew the face for the revolution, in effect. And he's now launching a publishing revolution online with Aces Weekly, which you really should go and check out, acesweekly.com. And Parassassin appeared over an 8-month period as a serial on Aces Weekly, and now it's been collected into a single volume and brought up by Marcosia. It's a paradoxical time-traveling romp, which also contains a lot of political parody and assassination, time travel, paradox, and it's just one giant great romp. And again, it's one of these stories where you will have no idea where it's going, and it will continue to put you loads of turns right up to the very, very final page. And hopefully a few tiny secrets of the universe will be revealed to you that you weren't aware of before.
Love it. Jasper, are you still working on a webcomic?
I am. It's just been launched. It's at my website, jasperbark.com, and the webcomic is called Fearfix. And it's something of an homage to both the old EC horror comics, like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, but also the wonderful black and white comics, which came out in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s, published by people like Warren and Skywald. And all of these comics, and so kind of very dark but great fun rollicking tales, often which are kind of like a bit of a Shaggy Dog story with a wonderful surprise ending that you don't see coming. And there's a new story up every month. And like all of those comics as well, this particular comic has a very dark, eldritch and eerie horror host. But in this instance, this dark, eerie, slightly creepy, strange horror host is actually the author. It's me. I appear as a comic strip character in my own strip, as a host, as a kind of like comified Rod Serling, walking on at the beginning and strolling on at the end in a variety of guises as a comic strip character hosting this web strip. It's called Fearfix. So if you go to jasperbark.com/Fearfix, you can read it for absolutely free. It goes up for free every month. So do go and check it out if you've any liking at all for horror comics. And even if you haven't got a liking for horror comics, go and check it out, because once you've read it, you certainly will have a liking for horror comics.
How wonderful. Jasper, this has been a great joy for me to get to talk with you. I feel like we could just go on all night, but it's getting on.
Too.
Yeah, it's getting on midnight your time, so we should probably wrap this up. Where can people find you? You mentioned your website just a minute ago. If people want to, dig into all that you do and follow you, where all can they find you?
I'm all over social media. Please go and check me out on my website. As I said, that's www.jasperbark.com. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page and a Facebook profile. Just look for Jasper Bark. I'm at Jasper Bark on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram. I'm not on Snapchat. But also, please also go and check out, if you like what you hear and you'd like to make a personal connection with me, do go and check out some of the amazing perks I've got on my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Jasper Bark.
Absolutely. And I'll put links to all of that in the show notes if you want to follow Jasper and connect with him and support his Patreon. We encourage you to do that. Jasper, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've had an absolute blast.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
A crowd had formed in the parking lot of Phillipsburg Manor, waiting to be let in. Security patrolled the entrance to the event, keeping the crowd at bay until darkness fell. The Horseman's Hollow banner hung above the gates, a vampire and witch gargling blood for the camera. The line stretched from the gates all the way to the concession stand at the other end of the parking lot. Jason's pupils gorged themselves on the sights across the water. Blue light splashed across the manor's windows and etched lines in its facade, so that Jason imagined an icy campfire beneath the chin of a storyteller. A blurry duplicate floated in the mirror of the mill pond. The wind stirred a cauldron of sound. Phantoms warbled through the fog. Witches at Sabbath cawed and bubbled. A skeleton played the harpsichord. The first clots of visitors began to circulate, adding a new ingredient to the brew. Yelps of surprise that skipped over the mill pond, raising ripples of nervous laughter from the kids still in line. Somewhere in the night the devil perched on a tombstone and fiddled for the dead. A row of lanterns on hooks hung at waist level, drawing them along. Zeph slipped a hand around Kate's waist as they walked. Jason hung back until a handful of others had entered and ambled into the darkness himself. He kept his eyes on Kate, but he trailed behind as much as he could. He felt like a stalker, and he didn't want to be obvious. He could see the other bridge on the far side of the water, an aisle of rickety boards that ran along the top edge of the mill pond's dam. A row of dwarfish shadows had assembled there. Children? Mannequins? How had he missed them before? The figures opened glowing eyes and began to sing a playground tune. La 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 la. Jason's flesh crept. Why are children so terrifying? I wasn't that creepy when I was little, was I? The lanterns ended at the graveyard, a field of false headstones lit with green and pink. A man checked their tickets again and passed them through. Kate's hair shimmered green as she strolled among the graves. The path led into a false tomb. Inside, a coffin containing a corpse drew Zeph's attention, and he failed to notice an actor disguised as a statue. The statue shrieked. Zeph jumped comically, struck the doorframe, and stumbled through. Jason gave a thumbs up to the statue as he exited the tomb. He pushed the velvet aside and thought that Kate had caught sight of him and waved, but maybe not. She was grinning, having fun, and was much amused by Zeph's skittishness. A gravedigger sprang from the shadows. Zeph cried out. A skeleton popped out of a carriage. Zeph cried out. A branch poked his sleeve. Zeph cried out. A girl in the line said, "Boo!" Zeph cried out, earning laughter and catcalls. Jason didn't join in. He felt that the crowd was winding a toy that might explode at any minute. He'd seen the Van Brunt temper. But it was funny. He found himself fumbling for his phone. A figure appeared at his side at once. A security guard dressed in black from tricorn hat to leather gloves, his face shrouded by black cloth. "No video," muttered the faceless thing. Jason tucked his phone away and nodded in apology. A 3/4 moon hung above. From all directions came the cries of actors, the squeals of girls, the drone of ghosts, the children's choir, the crunching of feet on pebbles. Pumpkins flickered, candles danced, crimson, orange, and blinding white burned in every tree. Floodlights turned the plaster of the manor into cracked blue skin. He found Kate and Zeph in the lair of the redcoat zombies. Joey tried in vain to menace Zeph. His makeup was terrifying, but a ridiculous purple wig spoiled the effect. "Nice hair," Zeph giggled. Apparently, Joey was the only thing Zeph wasn't scared of. Joey rose to the challenge, though, hissing, clawing the air and chewing the scenery. Literally, he grabbed a severed arm and gnawed on it. But the damn wig was just too silly. He gave up, disappointed, and Kate and Zeph walked on. "Run!" Jason whispered in mock terror as Joey approached. "It's the flesh-eating corpse of the Queen Mother!" Joey stayed in character. He seized Jason by the neck and clacked teeth to bite through his skull, but then stopped, released Jason, and shambled away, wheezing, "No brains, no brains." Zeph cried out ahead. People laughed. Someone had gotten him. Jason pushed through and saw Zeph cursing at one of the actors, a redcoat buried in dirt to the waist, disguised as a severed torso leaning against a fence. Zeph was kicking dirt in the man's face and screaming at him. Kate was turning circles with a hand raised to her temple. A black-shrouded security ghost ordered Zeph to leave. "They're all targeting me," Zeph snapped. "Rip out his spine and chew on it," hissed one zombie.
Stick his head on a pike for the crows,
gibbered another. Zeph climbed over the rope. Let's go, he said to Kate. She shook her head. I'm going through. This cost money. Fine. I'll be outside when you're done having fun. He stalked away with the security guard. Kate walked backwards up the trail, half expecting Zeph to return. He didn't. She disappeared around a corner.
Oh my,
said Zombie Joey, wheezing into Jason's ear.
It's wandered off, ain't it? Ought to be careful, tasty little thing like that, eh? Someone might,
he clacked his teeth,
eat her up.
He pushed Jason forward and limped off to dine on a tourist from Florida.